Okay, welcome back. So now we're going to move up the pyramid to the secondary sector, manufacturing. And this really becomes important right about the time, if I can turn the right page here, of the Industrial Revolution. Right about the 1700s begins. And this is where we see large-scale manufacturing becoming a big part of the economy. It isn't that we didn't have manufacturing before the 1700s, but it was done in small shops, individual homes. You didn't have huge factories. Beginning in the 1800s, you start seeing factories that make millions of things, and a big part of the economy becomes manufacturing. A Soviet um, economist looked at the history of the Industrial Revolution, and his name was Kondratov. He speculated there were four Kondratov cycles. Basically, the way that industrial society was organized was based on a specific innovation, a leading form of manufacturing that was so important it not only affected how the secondary sector worked, but it affected the way society operated. And there's four of them we're going to talk about. Each is associated with a specific industry and an example of a city. So, for instance, the first one is textiles. The very first wave of industrialization was textiles, making fabrics through factories. Before this, people wove their fabrics at home on spinning wheels. Very labor intensive, took a lot of time. Now, in a factory, one machine in a factory could make what one person in a home could make all year, could make in one day. So, much more efficient. You could sell it at a much better rate. And the key innovation was the power loom, the machine that took the place of the home weaver. So the key industry in this area in this time was cotton, the cotton industry to provide the material for textiles, but also iron to make the machinery. And this was kind of focused on towns. Towns became very important as opposed to villages and the countryside. Okay. And then in 1845 it kind of peaks and the next wave. And this becomes steelmaking. And steelmaking used steel big factories in large cities because with steel you could make things like railroads and you could make more machines and manufacturing and boats. And so that's the next big wave. Beginning about the turn of the century, we start seeing mass production, making millions of things all exactly the same. The automobile, right? You're making a million cars a year and they're all the same. The electric light, right? And here the big industry is chemicals, cars, huge factories like Detroit. And today we are in what they call the high-tech wave. And so I think we're all pretty familiar with the idea of the computer, right? It's ubiquitous in our life. We all probably have at least 3 or 4 different computers we don't even think about. You must have a computer for this class most likely. Or that's one. You probably have maybe 2 or 3 at home. You use them at school and at your work. We use them all over our society. We have phones that are computers. There are mini computers on our cars. Some people even have them in their refrigerators. So it's just all over. Electronics. So let's explore these in depth. The very first cycle, manufacturing, and this is centered in Manchester, England. Manchester, England is considered the first industrial city of the world. Some of the first factories were built there. And with this, you have this rise of the manufacturing city. You have large numbers of people coming from the countryside to work in the factories. And for the first time, you have large working class populations. The second cycle, the iron and steel industry. And here, the exemplar city is Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. In fact, they're called the Pittsburgh Steelers football team because steel in Pittsburgh to this day. The third cycle is mass production. So we think about cars, and a good example is Ford. Henry Ford perfects the assembly line. He didn't invent the assembly line, by the way, but he took it and he made it work very well with cars. And so if you're not familiar, just a quick refresher. Before Henry Ford, each car was made by a team of 5 or 6 guys from the ground up. They all got together and they built it like a kit. Henry Ford said, what if one person built the wheel, one person worked on the seat, one person put the wheel on the axle, the next person put the axle on the frame, the next person took the frame and put the engine on it. Everyone did one job. They stood where they were, and the car came past them, and they did it over and over again. And it allowed them to build basically many, many more cars for a lot less cost. So manufacturing. And this led to these huge auto factories. Basically, these just mini cities. They were so big. And this idea of making millions of cars all the same. Used to say that Henry Ford's Model T was the first mass-produced car. No more. In fact, to this day, it's still the second or third most made car ever. Used to say you can have it any color you want as long as it's black. It's just easy to make black cars. One paint, one color. But this idea of manufacturing at this big, huge factory is called Fordism. Okay? Named after him. Detroit. Cars. Detroit City. We'll get to the fourth cycle in a little bit. But in the 1970s, and what leads to the fourth cycle is this lead away from industry. In the 1970s, we see industry shift from areas that were paying high wages like New York, Chicago, Detroit, and then move to countries where they could pay people less, like China, Korea, Japan, Thailand, because labor is a big cost. Now, the reason they had never done this before is if you made something in another country that was, because like if you made something in China in the 1950s, it was very expensive to ship it back over here. There were laws about that to discourage it, and the transportation cost was extremely high. But beginning in the 1970s and 80s, transportation improves to this day now where we can ship things around the world much cheaper. We don't think anything of parts for our phones coming from China or Japan. And then free trade agreements, laws that made it easier to trade. And why would you do that if it allows industry to move? Well, the big thing is, the thought with free trade is that if everybody can do what they do best, and maybe that means some countries are manufacturing and some are service, they'll do better at it. That more trade, no matter where it is better. And so this whole movement in the 70s allows the Asian tigers like South Korea and Taiwan and China to become much more prosperous because their economies became much more industrial. They took over what the United States and England and Germany had been doing. They became the industrial powers. Okay? And what are the consequences of this? The flat world means this, that if you eliminate the barriers of transportation costs and trade law, the world is economically flat, and free trade should make everybody wealthy, but the consequences are that countries that had industry, like Chicago, like the United States, like England, like Germany, see their industries leave. They move. They deindustrialize. And sustained growth occurs in those areas, like China, Taiwan, Singapore. It also has this effect of changing the societies. Class and gender changes. In a lot of these factories in Asia, this was the first time that a lot of women were allowed to work in a factory, making electronics or small parts. And so now they have economic independence, and that changes their role, their gender identity. They are no longer the wives of farmers. They can have their own lives in some ways. This idea of the working class. Before this, you had basically the poor farmers and the people who were in power, but now you've got the people in power, you've got the working class, you've got the farmers, and maybe you have the people, the shop owner class. You kind of have these differences. But that global shift of heavy industry opens up the way for countries like the United States to get into the fourth cycle of high-tech information and technology. So not only do we make the most important, the computers and the smartphones, but another aspect we'll talk about is information. We sell information as well. We'll talk about that with the service industry. With this cycle, manufacturing, it's important to note there's a distinction between invention and innovation. So when you think about, electronic companies, they don't really invent anything brand new, but what they do is take what's out there and they make it better. So Apple did not invent the smartphone, the iPhone, right? First of all, the cell phone had been around for a while. We had music players before that, so the music player was around. The ability to use the internet on cell phones was around before Apple. But what Apple did was take all of that and put it into one easy-to-use thing, the iPhone. You combined a phone and a music player and a small computer, right? And this drives innovation with programming and apps and all this technology. And now smartphones are a huge issue. The very first computers, actually, in the 1890s, we had mechanical machines. These actually were a series of gears. You would insert a card with punched holes that it could read, and it would do calculations for you. It was a big calculator. Because then in the end, that's kind of what a computer is. This just wasn't as fast or as efficient, but it was faster than doing it by hand. So really, all we've done is making this better. We start seeing vacuum tubes, transistors, the guts of the computer come out right here, right? We have personal computers in 1981, but really it isn't until we start getting laptops that everyone can carry around that they become extremely efficient. And then the internet in 1994, I mean, that allows computers to talk to everybody else. And with the rise of the internet and that innovation, right, that used phone lines. They've been around since the 1870s. So it's not that this was a brand new invention, the fourth wave. We just took all these other things and we just made them better. So today, right, where is this centered? The exemplar city? Silicon Valley, which is here. This is San Francisco in California. And this is Oakland and Berkeley. Down here you have cities like San Jose. And you have down here headquarters for companies like Apple, Google, Hewlett-Packard, Dell, a lot of high-tech information technology innovations. All right, we're going to pause here. And that is the end of the manufacturing aspect of the economy. And then we're going to come back with the last part, the top of the pyramid, services.